And so I am really pleased to introduce I'm going to say it, my most favorite coworker, Amy Lentz with the Boulder County Extension Office. She's a home horticulture agent, and she is going to talk to you today about fruit trees for Colorado. So take it away, Amy.
Thanks so much, Allison. Feelings mutual. Does my slide look okay to you?
Looks fantastic.
Great. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started then. I've got a lot to cover today in our hour class. I'm going to cover fruit trees for Colorado. We're going to talk about all different types of fruit trees. So before I get started, I just want to give you a little background about myself and kind of some of the work that I did before I came out to Colorado. I came to Colorado in 2016. Prior to that, I worked for Morehead State University, which is in the northeastern part of Kentucky. And there we had an apple orchard, a very large apple orchard that we were tasked with maintaining along with our research farm. But prior to that, this picture that you see in front of you actually was taken about 15 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long. I was a research analyst for the University of Kentucky and worked a lot on their fruit variety trials. So it's just kind of a fun pic. Throwback, it's not really Thursday, throwback Wednesday, I guess. But back to that apple orchard that I helped manage for Morehead State University. That was located in Wallingford. It's a little town that sits up on top of a ridge in the Appalachian Mountains, and again, run by Morehead State University. That was a really unique experience for me. It gave me a lot of good working experience, real experience, not just things to learn in a textbook. When we started that process, it was a 3,000 tree orchard with 25 different varieties of eating and cider types, mostly eating types. And we did a renovation of that orchard because it was out of production for a few decades. So when we came in, a lot of the trees hadn't been pruned for a really long time. A lot had to be removed. We took out, about half of the trees, and today there's still over 1,600 trees in production at that orchard. Again, great experience. I was the supervisor for that project, and everything was done by students. And it was not just the same students every time. It was a different group of students every day. And so we always had to start from scratch, teaching new things, but really all the credit goes to them. They did a lot of the work, the pruning, the harvesting, the packaging, you name it. They were out there working hard. So gave me a whole new respect for how difficult it is to grow fruit. But that was Kentucky. This is Colorado, and things are way different here. Things kind of just grew back east, but here we have a lot more to think about. So we have things like low humidity. That's fruit trees generally like a more humid climate. But the bigger thing is probably the fluctuating temperatures here in Colorado. It is not uncommon for us to go from the 70s and 80s down into the 30s. We see it all the time. And that's probably one of the main reasons that we have trouble growing some fruit trees here. We have alkaline or high pH soils, whereas back east, we had acidic soils. Fruit trees tend to like acidic soils. So again, another thing working against us. We have wind, we have intense sunlight because we have less of the atmosphere to filter out that sun. We also have a much shorter growing season than a lot of places in the United States, and then a lack of water. And so a lot of things working against us here, but we can still do it. There are plenty of fruit trees that you can grow in Colorado. Why do people want to grow fruit trees? Lots of different reasons for this, but mostly it's because they produce that delicious fruit, that nutritious fruit that we all want. But fruit trees can also have seasonal beauty. A lot of times these are ornamental as well as, functional trees. They can provide shade to your yard. Maybe you have a smaller yard and you can't grow a big shade tree, but a fruit tree might be more suitable for that space. A lot of our fruit trees only get to be 20, 25 feet tall if they're a standard tree. Maybe you just need a hobby, and this is a good hobby for you. It will keep you busy, and know that it's a little bit more than a hobby sometimes. Your trees are going to need special care. They're going to need annual pruning, and then you'll also have to be thinking about insects and diseases and monitoring and managing for those different things. So lots to think about with fruit trees. What we're going to do in today's class is we're going to go through a lot of the different general aspects of fruit trees, and then toward the end of the class, we'll go through some specifics for different types. So let's start by thinking about before you even get started with a fruit tree. If you are going in at the beginning and you're considering planting a fruit tree, there are a few things that you should think about. Number one is, do you have room for that tree to grow? And I'm going to talk today a lot about tree size and how to kind of manipulate that size, how to manage for that size. But really, you just need to make sure that whatever tree you're choosing, that you have space for that tree to grow. You also want to make sure that you have a water source to that tree. Fruit trees are not xeric. They do need a good amount of water. And when you think about it, think about picking a fresh peach or a fresh apple. A lot of that fruit is water content. You also want to have a plan of how to deal with the messy fruit drop, especially if you're using that fruit tree for more ornamental purposes and you don't plan to be harvesting all the time. You just want to have a plan for that. Know that fruit trees produce fruit, so you're going to get that. You'll also want to plan, again, for that time to work with that tree several times a year, depending on the season, pruning in the winter, scouting in the spring, summer, and then dealing with the harvest in the fall or the late summer fall. And then finally, you'll have to think about wildlife. And in Colorado, we definitely have some pressure from wildlife, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, like I said, it's difficult to grow in Colorado, but at the same time, there are still a lot of fruit trees that you can grow here. You can grow apples, pears, peaches, apricots, plums, and cherries, just to name a few. But there are a few other more interesting and unique trees that we can see as well, like hardy figs, things like that. So another question you'll want to ask yourself is, you might decide what type of tree. Maybe you really love peach trees and peaches. Then you'll want to start to look at what variety you should grow, because within each of those different types of fruits, there are lots and lots of different varieties. In fact, there are about 7,500 varieties or cultivars of apples that are grown around the world. Now, commercially, they're only growing, maybe 100 or so different varieties, because that's what people know to find in the grocery stores. It's what they're used to. But there are so many other varieties out there, 7,500 varieties. Peaches have over 2,000 varieties grown globally, but again, paring that down for the commercial industry to what they know works. But there's a lot of also heritage type varieties out there. And there's a couple of programs around that are trying to bring back antique varieties, older varieties like the Boulder Apple Tree Project, the Montezuma Orchard Project. Both of these groups are looking at finding those older apples like the Colorado Orange and bringing those back to life and back into production. So pretty cool. But when you're choosing a variety, they're really going to give you a lot of differences. So you're going to have differences in fruit size and appearance. You'll have differences in taste between different varieties. One of the more important things here in Colorado is bloom period. We'll talk about this at length, and ripening season, very important because we have a short season and we have pressures from spring frosts. But some varieties are also really good for disease resistance. I remember one that we used to grow back in Kentucky called Liberty, and it was a very fire blight disease resistant variety. And so we do have that pressure here. We'll talk about that. And so you may want to be choosing disease resistant varieties as well. And then pollen compatibility, that's just one of the other things to consider when you're choosing your variety. So I know this chart that you're seeing in front of you can look a little bit overwhelming, and the goal here is just to show you how many different attributes you can have with different varieties. So this is just showing, I don't know, maybe a couple dozen apple varieties, but you can see here that there are early bloomers, mid bloomers, late bloomers. Then there's different periods of ripening. Some are ripening in, August or September, but others are going to wait until October. There's different hardiness zones. We're going to cover that in just a couple of slides. Again, that resistance to diseases. But then also there's just different flavors, different textures. Are they firm? Are they crisp? Are they soft? And then different uses. Some of these apple varieties specifically, I'll kind of talk a lot about apples just because it's kind of what I know. But some of these apple varieties are better for baking and pies, whereas others are better for fresh eating. And so it can be a lot to think about, but it can also be really fun to choose what variety fits with what you want to grow. So I want to break this down more into a home orchard plan instead of looking at the commercial industry, just because I think most of you here are joining us today for a home orchard. So let's kind of go through how you would set up your own little home orchard, whether that's 1 tree or 8 trees like you see here. The first thing you want to consider is hardiness. This is the big limiter here in Colorado. Now, hardiness refers to the ability of a tree to withstand low temperatures in the winter. So it really kind of gives you that bottom line. And so if you look at this chart here, you'll see that for me here in Boulder County, I'm probably in that light blue color, which says it's a 5B. And according to the chart, you know, this can handle temperatures down to about -15 before we start to see damage. But with fruit trees, there's so much to think about, and they're so susceptible to frost, especially in the buds, that I like to say go a zone lower, at least 1 zone lower. So if I'm out there choosing a tree for my yard, I'm looking to make sure that it's hardy to zones 3 or 4. And really those cultivars that are developed in the upper Midwest and the Northeast USA, those are going to be generally okay for Colorado too. So kind of find out where your tree is coming from. A lot of the commercial nurseries and for orchard trees, you can purchase those as a homeowner. And a lot of them have orchards that are up in those northern regions like New York and Michigan and Minnesota. So definitely think about hardiness as one of the first things. Then you want to think about our growing season. So as I mentioned in Colorado, that growing season is now shortened depending on where you are in the state. So it can be anywhere from 70 to 185 days. Up in the mountains, if you're in, say, Leadville or Breckenridge or anywhere up at elevation, your growing season might be 70 to 90 days, less than 100 days. And so you want to look for cultivars that are going to mature in a very short period of time. If you're down in the southeast corner, you might have a much longer growing season of 185 days, and you don't have the hardiness issues at those in those locations, and so you have a lot more availability to what you can grow. Again, that hardiness refers to the low temperature. What it doesn't take into account are these big swings in temperature that we get, and so sometimes our trees just have trouble acclimating to that fluctuation in temperature. So that's for the tree itself, that -20. So I put some temperature extremes on the slide there, and you see that -20, you'll see some tissue death in the tree. -40, you're going to get total death of that tree. But there's also the buds to consider, and it's those late spring frosts that may not kill your tree, but they can damage the flower buds, which are then going to turn into your fruit. So again, lots to think about in terms of temperature. And a lot of times it's just kind of a gamble, and that's okay. You're going to grow that fruit tree, cross your fingers, hope for those earlier spring frosts and that they're not happening, you know, in late May when the tree is in bloom. Now, when you're planting your home orchard, if you haven't planted that tree yet and you have some sort of terrain to deal with on your property, then you want to think about planting that tree either on a slope or at the top of a slope. Most of us have flat yards, so this may not be a factor for you. But if you do have that rolling terrain, you want to avoid those low spots because cold air sinks and warm air rises. And so if you are planting that tree, say down into a ditch or in a low spot, it can actually change the temperature quite a lot, and you can have a frost where you normally wouldn't have a frost, and some of those blooms can get nipped. So on the slope or at the top of the slope is the best location. That orchard picture I showed you from the very beginning, that is at the top of a ridge, and it's perfect climate for fruit trees. So we've talked about tree hardiness, and yes, the trees do have their own hardiness level. Again, that -20, you'll start to see some dieback, but it's really those buds that we're worried about in the spring. So as the spring temperatures warm up, that causes the buds of those trees to break open, and the tree will then kind of de-harden itself. It'll come out of dormancy. So spring is the most vulnerable time for us to see winter kill of those buds. And the level of that bud death actually varies depending on what stage that bud is in. So I'm going to get a little sciencey in the next few slides and show you kind of how this works. So there is this entire branch of science called phenology, and that means it deals with the relationship between the climate and then these periodic biological changes. So these are things like bird migration, plant flowering, anything that has temperature or climate relating to different stages of development. And so this is what you see in front of you is a figure of growth stages for an apple. And they go from, there's 9 different stages, they go from dormant to fruit set. And so as you work your way across this chart, you can see that when they're dormant, those buds are very tightly closed, not open at all yet. Then you get just this little bit of a silver tip showing through. And then the silver tip kind of opens up a little bit and you get green tip. Those are the tips of the new leaves emerging. 1/2 inch green is when those green leaves are a 1/2 inch long. I always joke that horticulturalists, we're not really the most creative people. We just describe things as we see it. So 1/2 inch green means 1/2 inch green. As those leaves start to open up, you'll see that tight cluster of flower buds, but those flowers are not quite open. Then they'll turn pink. Then they'll be fully open in full bloom. That's number 7 in the bottom left corner. Then those petals will start to fall off and you'll get fruit set. And you might be like, wow, this is a lot to think about, all these different stages of bud development. But again, it all relates back to temperature, and those temperatures are different for each of these different stages of development in terms of what can make it through. So this is showing those same bud stages across the top. This is for cherries and peaches. And what you'll notice here is that if your cherry tree, for example, in the spring is totally closed up, it's just swollen bud stage like this, no flowers showing yet, you know, we can get down to 15 degrees Fahrenheit and you might lose about 10% of those buds because of that freeze. We can get down to 0 and you're going to lose 90% of those buds. But look, as you move across these different stages, as those flowers open up, that temperature threshold raises. And so in full bloom, if we just get, so this, you're talking maybe a month later, if we just get down to below freezing at 28 degrees, you're going to get 10% loss. A little bit lower at 25, which is common here. We can get down to 25 in late May. No, you know, it happens all the time. You will lose 90% of those flower buds. Now, remember, the tree is going to be fine because the hardiness level of the tree is much lower, but you won't get fruit that year. The next year, those buds will redevelop and you should be okay again. Same thing for peaches, similar temperatures really there as well. This next chart is just kind of a summary of that chart. And what this shows you is that apples are really our most reliable crop, especially here along the Front Range. At full bloom, you know, we can get down to 27 and you still have pretty good, the buds are still going to be alive and you're going to get fruit set. You know, peaches though, you know, they have a little bit lower of or a higher threshold, I should say, with temperature, and they're just a little bit more sensitive. So at the bottom here, I've got in sequence, this is the sequence that things actually bloom. So first things to bloom are going to be your apricots. They're blooming really early, you know, end of March, early April, mid-April, and we are really getting those cold temperatures still. So it's very rare that you would get a crop off an apricot tree here in Colorado. If it's in a really protected location and it's not seeing those temperature shifts, or if you're in the middle of town where you have a little bit of a heat island, you might get a better chance of getting a crop. Then come the peaches, they're the next to bloom in the spring, then the cherries bloom, then the pears bloom, and then finally the apples bloom. And so because those apples and pears are later bloomers, again, those temperatures by that time in the season have risen and you have less of a chance of losing your crop. Pollination is another thing to consider when you're planning your home orchard. Pollination is just a term that describes the transfer of pollen from the male parts of the flower, those are the anthers that you see here, onto the stigma, which is the female part of the flower. Once that pollen touches the stigma, it's carried down into the into the plant and it pollinates that fruit in the future. And I've got a picture to show you on the next slide. The thing to keep in mind is that some fruit trees are self-pollinating, other fruit trees are cross-pollinated. It really depends on the type of fruit and the variety. Even within the same kind of fruit, you might have some trees being self-pollinating and some trees being cross-pollinated. Someone asked in the chat, oh, when do plums bloom? Good question, Kirsten. They're kind of, I would say they're after peaches, right before the pears and apples, and they're pretty reliable here as well. And then Katie asked, when I said plant apricots in a protected area, that means some sort of protection from wind, from temperature. You know, maybe it's in the corner of a building, in the inside corner of a building, or next to some other trees that are just going to protect it. Yeah. So to show you what this looks like on a flower, this is the male part of the flower. This is where the pollen is on the anthers and filaments. Actually, it sits up here on the anthers. These together are called the stamen. Again, that's the male part. And the bees, when they pollinate, they will carry that pollen from the anther up to the stigma. And then this is kind of a sticky plant part, and it will attach that pollen and then draw it down in. And then here is where you have the ovary, and that turns into your fruit. So as I mentioned, some fruit trees are going to be self-pollinating, some are cross-pollinated. You can find these charts out there in the literature. This one's a little bit older, but what you can see here is same varieties. These are apples, same varieties across the top as we have along the side here. And you can see that almost everything is partially self-fruitful to itself. Basically, that means that your tree will probably produce some fruit, even if you don't have another type of tree around. But other trees need or prefer to have a different variety to pollinate them. So you can see that, you know, like a Jonathan can pollinate a Fuji and vice versa. And so that, again, it just helps to have, if you're going to be growing trees that are preferably cross-pollinated, to have two different varieties around. Now with apples, interestingly, you can also have crab apples be a cross-pollinator of apple trees. So if you plant an apple in your neighborhood, in your yard, there's a good chance, if you're in one of these tighter neighborhoods, that someone within 100 feet of you has a crab apple or an apple. And so you're going to get that good cross-pollination. Some things don't make good pollinizers. And you can see that in the chart too with these lines. It says that they just don't pollinate very well. So in general, these are big boxes that I'm putting around these different types of fruits. But in general, apricots, sour cherries, peaches, nectarines, and European plums are going to be generally self-pollinated. And then apples, sweet cherries, pears, and Japanese plums are generally cross-pollinated. Again, that compatible tree is going to be best if it's within 100 feet, but bees can travel up to a mile. So, you know, they're moving around your neighborhood, grabbing that pollen from different sources. And so you should be in pretty good shape if you live, again, in close proximity to other people with any kind of fruit tree. So here's a picture of a home orchard. This is on a bigger scale for a home orchard. But one thing I want to mention here before I get into the soils is you see this nice big fence around this orchard. This is something that we should definitely consider in Colorado, especially if you're where there's a lot of wildlife. Deer can jump a 6-foot fence. 8 feet, they have a little bit more trouble. Bears, you know, they can climb over a little fence. They'll want to get to your apples or your pears or peaches as well. So having a nice fence around your little home orchard can be a really great way to deal with wildlife. Now, as far as soils go, most fruit trees want a well-drained loam soil, and we don't have a lot of loam in Colorado. Usually we're looking at, you have either clay or you have sand. Now, if you're in town and you have a well-aged property, sometimes over time that soil is more weathered, and so it might actually be a little bit more loamy. But if you have sand, and you can there are different ways to test your soil, and you can send a sample off to a lab to find out. But if you have sand, it's going to drain more quickly. That water is going to hit the surface of that soil and move very fast because the pore space is large. If you have clay, though, you actually might have water sitting around that tree because clay tends to hold on to water much more tightly, and it doesn't necessarily drain as fast. It can also take more time for water to percolate down into a clay soil. And so in certain cases, you might want to think about amending your soil if you're going to plant fruit trees. We don't usually recommend a lot of amendments when we're talking about planting just regular ornamental trees because we want them to get used to the native soil. And that's also true with fruit trees, but they're, again, a little bit more finicky when it comes to soil. So if you are going to amend, you want to amend a very large area where you're planting. Also consider light when you're choosing that space or that plot for your tree. All of these fruit trees are going to do better if they have full sun. A heavily shaded fruit tree can still produce fruit, but that fruit's going to be high in sugar content. It's going to bruise easily. It's going to be a little bit mushy sometimes if it's not harvested right away. So full sun and decent soil. So another thing that's interesting about fruit trees is that they're grafted. And so what grafting means is it's just taking the top of one tree and putting it onto the bottom of another tree. So I want to say almost all fruit trees are going to be grafted. And the top of that graft, which is this part here called the scion, that's the part that you want to eat. That's your Honeycrisp. That's your Gala, whatever kind of fruit variety you want to eat. It has the good flavor. It has the big fruit. The bottom part, called the rootstock, actually helps that tree grow better in different locations. And so you can tailor your fruit tree to grow well in heavy clay soils with fire blight pressure by getting a resistant rootstock, but then you can have that really good, Brayburn or whatever type of apple is your favorite on the top. You can do this on your own, or you can just go ahead and purchase your trees already grafted. I would recommend that you look for your trees at local nurseries or through companies that do mail order type stuff, like Stark Brothers, places like that. Because our big box stores tend to buy fruit trees from different locations across the US, and you may not know where that tree is coming from. And it could be coming from Mississippi or where I'm from in Kentucky, and it's just not going to be the right rootstock or the right combination for our growing area. So do your research, have fun with this, look online. Again, tons of mail order orchards out there. Here are some pictures of how you graft a fruit tree. This is the top part of the tree here, and then that's the scion, and then here you can see the rootstock. And this isn't a total graft, it's like a side graft. But what's going to happen is those two vascular systems are going to line up over time, they're going to grow together, and then you're going to start to get transport throughout that entire new tree. Here you can see after a graft has healed over, and you do get some suckering. Oh, one slide too many. There you go. You do see some suckering coming from the rootstock. Rootstocks are typically not good for eating, and so you'll be wanting to come in and remove those little suckers as you see them if they're below the graft union. So it's quite fascinating how they make these trees. It'll take about a season for a graft to heal and meld together, and then after that you can plant that little tree now out into your yard. Here are just some other pictures of how that graft looks. If you're walking around town and you see a fruit tree, look at the base of that tree. You will likely still see that graft union in place. And so usually when you're planting your tree, you want to make sure that that graft union is at least 2 to 3 inches above the soil level, because you can get rot where those two pieces have come together. So you want that above the soil where it can breathe and grow. And then again, looking for those suckers that come from below and cutting those off. So plant on the high side when planting fruit trees. Make sure that graft is above ground. I'm seeing a couple of questions coming in. I've seen that little pink little stripe of paint on the base of tree trunks in nurseries. What does it mean? Kathleen, I think that I'm not positive what that little stripe of paint means, but it might just be their way of indicating different types of rootstocks so that they can easily look and say, oh, okay, these are all M26s or something like that. Also, once the plant tag comes off of that rootstock, you might lose track of what kind it is. So I'm guessing that that's just their way of identifying. Yeah, coding for the nursery. Thank you, Allison. Would it be okay to graft shoots from 2 adjacent grafted apple trees of different varieties? Yes, to create a continuous living fence. Good question, Carl. Yes, we call this espalier. I'm not going to have time to talk about that today, but these are trees that are grown flat like a fence. They have a main trunk, and they'll often have a rootstock with that main, that main type. And then, yes, you can graft different types of apples. If it's apples, you can go apples. You can't graft, you can, but it's not very reliable to graft different species together, but you certainly can graft different varieties together. And you can create a nice espalier fence-like situation. So yes, it's very possible. And then yes, when you are planting, you want to make sure that you're not planting too deep or too high, but the key here is just to make sure that graft union is not below the ground. Okay, let's move on a little bit more. These are just some more pictures of different grafts. Here you can see a lot of our ornamental cherries, especially the weeping kind, like a weeping Hygan cherry. They're actually grafted way up high, almost right below where the crown starts. And then they weep down from there. Here's an older tree. You can still see that graft union after, a few decades. This tree is probably 30 years old at least. And that graft union is bulging, but that's okay. Those vascular systems at that point are working well, and that tree is growing just fine. Here's an example of those suckers I was mentioning from the base of the tree. Again, those are from the rootstock. A lot of times we'll have questions that come into the office where someone had a fruit tree and that fruit tree died back, and they're getting these suckers to come up, and they say, oh, well, I want to keep that tree growing. Can I just train one of these suckers? And the answer is, yeah, you could, but it's not going to give you the same type of fruit you had before. And in fact, that fruit might be kind of more like a crab apple than an apple or whatever. So not necessarily the best idea. And those suckers are never going to have the structural stability as if you were to start with a normal tree. So here's another chart to talk about these rootstocks. I mentioned that this is, again, the bottom of the tree. So you can see here, it's got the root system with it. There's that graft cut right up at the top there. And so these rootstocks, they can help you acclimate to different conditions. Like I mentioned, some of these have disease resistance, like fire blight resistance, or they might have better tolerance to certain soil types. But really the main reason for rootstocks is to reduce the size of the tree to be a more manageable size. And so you can see this tree here on the right-hand side. This is a normal, like a normal seedling, if it was just a standard tree. Again, I'm going to use apple as the example here. An apple tree can get to be, let's say, 30, 40 feet tall even, if it's a standard tree, ungrafted, no rootstock, it's just going to keep growing. You put it on these rootstocks though, and it reduces the height. And so down here, this one on the very end, this mark or B9, it can be 15 to 30% of the size of a standard tree. So that 30-foot tree is now a 10-foot tree. And again, this is going to be way more adaptable to a home orchard to have a smaller tree. So you want to be looking for dwarf, super dwarf. Some semi-dwarf can be still pretty tall, but you're looking for those dwarf and smaller trees for a home site. So these are different, they don't give these things fancy names. All of the M's here, it stands for mulling, B stands for Budkowski, and G stands for Geneva, and then they just give them numbers. So probably the reason that they're putting on those paint colors to make sure they know which one is which. Hard to discern. Okay, I'm gonna let Allison keep answering questions in the chat. Allison, stop me if there's something that you need me to clarify along the way. Let's jump into harvesting a little bit. So as I mentioned, these trees bloom at different times. They also tend to ripen and get harvested at different times as well. So your cherries and your apricots are some of the first to be harvested. It's happening in the middle of summer in June and July. Then you'll start to see your peaches and your plums come on, pears just a little bit later, and then apples again toward the end of the season. And so again, always thinking about when your last frost is in the spring, getting trees that are going to bloom late, but they're going to harvest early. So you're looking for that short maturity window. Now there are some exceptions to this, and some of these apples actually like to have a little bit of a frost at the end of their ripening time. So here's another chart to show harvest periods for apples by variety. And you can see that there are some apples, some summer apples that you'll be harvesting at the same time as you're harvesting cherries. Probably the main one I think of is Lodi. I know that's one that is grown in Colorado. It's a pretty short maturity window, but it's also a little bit of an early bloomer. But notice here that some of these go into October, November even. We used to have this York Imperial apple at the orchard I worked at in Kentucky, and it would be the last one that we would harvest. That one and Pink Lady. Love Pink Lady apples, really great for pies if you haven't tried that. And those are another one that actually will prefer to get frosted out. Now they're not going to want a really hard freeze, but a couple of light frosts, and it can actually make the sugar flavor a little bit higher and better. Speaking of sugar, you can harvest with a few different techniques. You can do the easy technique where you just go out, grab the fruit off the tree, take a bite, and if it tastes good, it's ready. Go ahead and harvest it. But you can also get really technical with this. This is what orchard growers use oftentimes because they have tons of trees, and after about 20 apples, you probably lose your sense of taste a little bit. So they're going out and they're measuring what we call bricks, which is just a measurement of sugar content in solution. And so this is a bricks meter that you see in the bottom picture here. And you would take a little chunk of that fruit, stick it in a garlic press, squeeze out some of the juice onto that plate, flip the lid down, and then look inside the tube, and it's going to show you exactly how much sugar content you have in that fruit. So this particular fruit is reading out at about 12%. And different fruits have different percentages to know when they're ripe. And so for like cherries, when they get to 14% sugar, great, go ahead and harvest. Peaches, same thing, about 14% sugar. Apples are excellent when they get up around 16, 18% sugar, then you know that they have a really nice flavor. So this is just kind of how the pros do it. So we talked about wildlife briefly. I showed you that picture of the orchard with the fence around it. We have a lot of different wildlife to deal with here in Colorado. We've got rabbits and birds and deer and bears that they don't deal with in other parts of the country. We also have squirrels and different rodents, things like that. But all of these critters want the fruit just as much as you do, because fruit, it's very tasty. And so you're going to be competing with wildlife to get that harvest. Really, the best way to deal with this is exclusion. Again, that 8-foot fence. And, sometimes even chicken wire can be big enough hole for some of these things to get through. So think about that. Maybe you want to use like a hardware cloth. One of the big ones that we see in our orchards across, especially in this Front Range area, I'm sure they have them on the West Slope too, are voles. These are little rodents that like to be under cover. So we see them often in the wintertime, tunneling under snow, staying protected, and working their way right up to the base of that tree. And then they start to munch on that bark. They love fruit tree bark. And so you can do things like add tree guards around the base of your tree that can kind of help deter them. Again, that you can get these spiral kind, they're plastic, like the one you see in the picture here. But again, that hardware cloth has really tiny holes, about a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and that's going to keep those guys out. chicken wire around the base of your tree might be just marginally effective. All right, I'm gonna quickly jump into looking at the chat here real quick. I see that Jennifer says 14 squirrels out of their yard. They lost most of their apples to squirrels. Any solution? Squirrels are the worst because they can climb, they can jump over things, they're very difficult. I'm not sure if I have a really super great, I don't know if I have a really great idea about squirrels. They're just tough. You just have to keep the fight going. Yes, they are awful. All right, maybe Allison can look up some squirrel deterrents. Now, I do know, I should say this, I do know that there are some old wives' tales of that might work. Fake owls. Generally, if you move them around a lot, critters and animals might think that they're real, and so they might just stay away. Also, those whirligig things that you can hang that kind of sparkle and shine, you can hang those up in trees. I've seen beach balls that look like giant eyeballs. Sometimes those can help deter the squirrels. Yeah, or put up an owl box and bring in the real owls, right? That might actually help to bring in some, we actually do talk about that when we teach commercial growers that, yeah, they can invite in, they can do falconry, they can bring in raptors, things like that. And then, yeah, it's just tough with squirrels. CDs, old CDs. Who listens to CDs anymore? I do, but those old ones, you can hang those. They have that light reflection. They'll spin around in the wind, and sometimes that's enough to kind of freak out some of those critters. Okay, let's jump over to pruning. Again, I got a lot to cover. We just have about 20 minutes left. And I'll be really brief about pruning. I have a separate class on pruning. It's about an hour long. It teaches you a lot of those techniques, and we're actually going to try to link that in our follow-up email so that for those of you that want to know more about pruning, you can watch that and really get deep into that subject. So there's just a few things to remember when you're pruning. You're pruning for dead, diseased, and damaged branches. Those are what we call the 3 Ds. I talked about it earlier, the removal of those suckers. You're trying to improve the tree strength. You're trying to promote branching. But the 2 biggest things I think are, if you can just remember this, it's better than anything. Increase air circulation and increase light availability into the canopy of that tree. If it's too thick and the light's not getting to that fruit, it's not going to be as good. So open the tree up, thin it out a little bit, and that's really going to improve your fruit quality. Now, different trees have different looking buds and different types of buds. I just want to point out the 2 main types of buds that we see, and those are leaf buds and flower buds. Leaf buds tend to be small, flat, flattened up against the stem. They almost look like a little dog nail, whereas fruit buds, especially for apples, they sit upright on these spurs. They're much bigger, fatter, plumper, and then oftentimes this spur will have a lot of wrinkles in it. Here are some pictures to show you different types of trees. Here again is that apple. You can see the fruit bud here, the leaf bud down here at the bottom. This is a pear, an Asian pear. You can see these have really wrinkly, we call these spurs with the fruit buds on top. And then plums are a little different. They have these clusters of flower buds all the way down the stem, and peaches are similar as well. Pears and apples, their spurs can be 15, 20 years old sometimes. They just keep growing a little tiny bit every year. That's why you get that little wrinkly compacted growth. Plums, actually, those flower buds are 2 to 5 years old, and so they'll overwinter and they'll keep going for a few years, and then they'll put on new buds. Peaches are very different though. They actually bloom on 1-year-old wood. So kind of a whole different technique. All of this is explained more in the pruning video. And so that's going to really help you when determining what branch to cut, what buds to leave back, things like that. Timing for pruning, late winter. You want to do this when these trees are dormant, when they're asleep. Just because I think of it like you know, if I'm going to have something done to me, something cut on me, I want to be asleep too. So it just, the tree is not going to respond in the same way when it's dormant. It's not going to want to flush out a bunch of new growth right away. You can do this late winter up until just before bud break or bud swelling. But once you see those buds start swelling, it's probably the window for pruning has now ended. So late winter, early spring, if you've got snowshoes or skis on and it's snow on the ground, perfect time. We would always prune usually January, February into early March. You want to avoid that late spring, early summer. One, because the tree's response is going to be different, but two, we have this disease called fire blight, and it affects our apples and our pears. Here's a tree, this was taken in Greeley. You can see the flagging on all these branches dying back. That is the bacteria of the fire blight that has been introduced into that tree, and it just kills off the tips of those branches. So it's around in the air in late spring, early summer. So we don't want to be opening up a bunch of wounds on the tree. If you do need to cut at this time of year to remove fire blight, or for any other reason, you'll want to sterilize your pruners between each cut so that you're not spreading that disease around. Again, a lot more on that in the pruning video. So overall, just to kind of sum up this pruning section, you're looking for a strong structural framework in that tree. You want to leave back those nice big branches with good angles. You're looking to increase the light penetration and the air circulation in the canopy of that tree. A really thick tree is not going to give you good fruit. You want it to be open. And then looking for dead, disease damaged, crossing branches, downward pointing branches, things like that. Bottom point there, you don't want to be removing more than 15 to 25% of the tree in any given pruning season. And for older trees, it should be much less than that, maybe only 10% of the tree if it's a very old tree. So it might take you several years of pruning to get a tree into the shape that you want it. So this is just, again, that first picture I showed you, a before and after of each of these trees. Here you can see before pruning and then after pruning, really opened up that tree, getting good light. The second one here, you can see it's pretty thick. It's been thinned out considerably and the height has been reduced. So you can also use pruning to help keep the tree at a manageable height. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to kind of rapid fire through specifics for each of these crops because most of everything I've talked about applies to everything in general. So let's quickly talk about apples. We've covered a lot about apples, so I'll move through this. The scientific name of apples is Malus pumila or Malus ex domestica. There's some debate on this name. I'm on the hybrid side, the ex domestica. That's what that X means. It means it's a hybrid. But apples, good for lots of different uses, from fresh eating to juicing to cider. There are specific varieties that are made just for hard cider. We used to grow one called Redfield, and it actually had a red flesh inside. Once you got through that skin, the middle of the apple was red. And we ended up growing that one and selling it to a local brewery who made red hard cider from it. So it was really cool. Size of apple trees, anything from a standard size tree, which is 30 to 40 feet, all the way down to a super dwarf, which can be 8 to 10 feet tall, again, with that graft. And usually apples need a pollinator. Here's a picture from that, this is from that Boulder Historical Society of that Boulder Apple Tree Project I was telling you about in the beginning, where they're trying to bring back some of these older types of apples. And they're still around. You know, the Front Range used to be a huge apple growing, fruit growing area. We used to have a big cherry industry, but over time things changed and weather happened, market forces happened, and things moved out. But if you're familiar with around the Thornton area, there's that shopping center called the Orchard. There actually used to be an orchard there. That's why they named it that. And I believe there are still some historic trees around that area. I showed you this chart earlier. Just again, lots to think about with apples. So do your homework, take some time to really think about what you like. Try some out at farmers markets, at grocery stores, find the one that works best for you. As far as harvesting and storage, again, that light frost won't usually damage the fruit, but a hard frost or freeze around 24 degrees can cause that fruit to start to drop to the ground. So you want to get your harvest in before you start to see that fruit drop. You can look for signs like a little bit of a blushing color on an apple, and that'll let you know when it's kind of ripe. You can also look for the surface to kind of change from this more dull surface to a more shiny surface. And then another thing to think about is as the temperatures get colder and colder, it increases the production of this hormone called ethylene, and that is the ripening hormone. So those cold temperatures are going to drive that ripening. And so as it gets colder and colder, it's going to happen faster and faster. So get out there again and harvest before you lose your fruit to the cold. Storage is also very different, a lot of variability between varieties. Some of those summer apples, I talked about Lodi earlier as a summer apple, you know, it only will keep for 1 to 2 weeks in storage. But some of those, you know, more cold tolerant apples, they're going to last for 3 to 5 months in cold storage, like in your refrigerator. So that's a really great thing about apples is they have a really great storing time. Pears, very closely related to apples. These are in the same family. They're both in the rose family, surprisingly. But there are 2 different types of pears, 2 main types. There's the European pear, Pyrus communis, which is the typical pear shape that we're all used to seeing. And then there's Asian pears, which are more rounded in their shape. Pears are usually going to bloom right before apples do. Usually you'll need that second variety for cross-pollination to give you a better crop. And there are so many different species of pears, and these, like apples, can live for a long time in the environment, and those little spurs that hold the fruit buds can also last for a very long time. Here's just a chart to show you some of the different types of pears that are out there. Bartlett is probably the most popular, the most widely grown pear that I'm familiar with. Here's that Asian pear in the middle. You can see it looks like an apple. I used to call these pear apples, but they taste much more like a pear. And then again, some of these will also have fire blight resistance because pears, apples in the same family, and so they're both susceptible to fire blight. So it is you want to be thinking about fire blight for both pears and apples. Here's a picture again of those spurs on the pear. You can see how crunched down those little spurs are because they're just growing a teeny tiny bit every single year. And then the fruit is set on the end. Moving on, again, this is just a quick little tips at the end of our class today. Moving on to peaches, nectarines, and apricots. These are all stone fruits. And so they're all closely related. The main ones we see growing in Colorado are peaches and apricots. The trees, again, are very hardy, and you'll see that when you're looking at different types. You'll see that they're hardy to -15, -20, but those buds are not as hardy. And so the flowers can get nipped because they're blooming early when the temperatures are still pretty cold here. Now on the west slope, they have a much more mild spring. They have a different climate on the west slope than they do on the east slope. And so they're going to have a better chance of growing those peaches with those mild temperatures, which is why we all go to Palisade for our peaches. You can still grow peaches on the Front Range, but just know that, you know, every few years you might get a crop, and then every few years you'll lose a crop. Here are just some different types of peaches. There's, you know, all kinds out there. Some need cross-pollination, some don't. Again, it depends on the variety, it depends on the tree. Most of them are going to give you some fruit as self-pollinators, but in most cases, if you add in that second tree, you're gonna get more fruit, better set. Here are some apricot varieties you can try, and even some nectarine varieties to try as well. But again, keeping in mind, apricots are the first to bloom. And so if you get a crop of apricots, count your lucky stars, you did it, and eat them and love them. And then you'll get them maybe 10 years later. Plums, pretty reliable here in Colorado. We have 3 main plums that are grown European plum is the standard one that you see most often. Those are those dark purple, blue colored plums. But we oftentimes also see the Japanese plum. That's the picture here on the lower left. They're usually more reds and orange and still a pretty decent size. And then we have American plums. These are the native plum, and they're going to be pretty small, about the size of a quarter or smaller. I have had some of these that are a pretty good flavor, but typically speaking, commercially, it's just the European and the Japanese plums that are being grown for commercial use. Here are some different varieties, again, that you can look at. E stands for European, O stands for Oriental or Asian. And so, yeah, lots of different kinds. Blue damson is probably the most popular kind that I see. And there are some varieties to avoid as well that may just not have the right situation here in Colorado to grow well. Plums like a well-drained soil. They like a high point on the property, just like those other fruit trees. They do like full sun. They like a sheltered area. We had this question come in earlier about what creates a sheltered area. And that would, again, be like next to a wall where you're going to block that wind, or even a fence can help shelter a tree a little bit. Cross-pollination is necessary with most of these plums. And again, they're going to also fruit on those spurs, but they're not quite as old as apples or pears. Just real quick, I want to mention this little tip. If you're planting something that's going to be an early bloomer and you want to try to prolong that bloom a little bit, if you plant your tree on the north side of a house, just far enough from the house that in the winter time that tree is shaded, but in the summertime when the sun gets higher in the sky, it's going to get full sun. So it's like that sweet spot. What that's going to do is it's going to keep those winter temperatures more mild, and it's going to eliminate some of that large fluctuation where the sun beats down during the day, and then at night the bottom drops out and it gets really clear, and we have those really biting cold nights. And then the next day the sun comes back out and it heats up the tree again. If you can keep it in the shade in the winter, but again, just far enough to where it gets full sun in the summer, it's going to kind of trick that tree into blooming maybe a little bit later and getting you past some of those frosts. So north side of the house for things like peaches and apricots might actually be your friend. Plums also have cross-pollination. I just talked about this. This is just one of those old charts to show you kind of what that looks like. These came from like a photo scan, so I don't know how available they are on the internet. And then finally, I want to end up with cherries. Cherries are used to be a pretty significant tree here in Colorado. We used to have one of the largest tree production or tart cherry production here in Loveland in the Larimer County area back around 1951. It was #2 in the nation for cherry production of tart cherries. Sweet cherries, not so much. Sweet cherries do better on the west slope. Tart cherries do much better here on the eastern slope or the Front Range. But basically, market forces happened. There was a very hard freeze, killed off a bunch of the cherry trees, and that industry left. Now, you can still find the Colorado Cherry Company around, and that's just the remnants of that industry still showing up for us here in Colorado. Tart cherries are going to be self-fruitful. You don't necessarily have to have a pollinator for those. They are, now the sweet cherries you will. They do get frost damage. These are blooming kind of just a little bit after apricots, maybe around the same time as peaches. So some years you'll get a crop, other years you won't. Probably the bigger factor with cherries are those birds who come in and swoop in and steal your cherries before you can get to them. So one thing that you can do for that is netting your tree. Be careful though, you can trap some of those birds as well, which is kind of a sad thing. So better yet, just get out there and harvest early and get as many as you can before the birds get to them. Here are some different varieties of cherries that you can grow. Montmorency is a pretty popular tart cherry that we grow here along the Front Range. I have seen Stella sweet cherries also being marketed along the Front Range, and I think they could do okay here as well. But the west slope, again, those mild temperatures really open you up to a lot more options, and they're growing some of those sweeter cherries like the Bing cherry, things like that. Harvesting cherries is quite the experience. There's just a ton of little tiny fruits, and so it takes some time to get them all. In the commercial industry, they're shaking these trees and just kind of dropping that fruit onto a piece of machinery that then conveyor belts them into boxes and things. So it's kind of cool to see how the commercial industry harvests these things, but you'll be out there just by hand picking as many as you can. Note that cherries don't have a very long shelf life either. You want to use these within a few days of picking. All right, we made it. I'm a couple of minutes over. I apologize if anybody had to go early. I do want to quickly just mention before I go that CSU Extension has a couple of really great fact sheets that kind of summarize a lot of what I talked about today. We have backyard orchard fact sheets, and there's one for apples and pears. That's 2.800. And then we have another one for stone fruits that covers peaches, plums, cherries, and apricots. So check those out for more information. And with that, I'll see if we have any last minute questions. And Allison, how did we do? Do we have any left?
Yes. Do you know, Amy, are there any resources for espalier for specific to Colorado? I can't think of a resource, but the process would be the same here or in Virginia. So.
Yeah, I want to say, look at even Minnesota has a lot of good fact sheets. And I think they're the ones that always come out with the new apple varieties, right? The Sweet 16 came out of Minnesota, Cosmic Crisp, right? I think Honey Crisp even. Yeah, a lot of good stuff coming out of Minnesota. So I would look to their fact sheets to see if you can find something specific to espalier. And it's a fun thing to try. And I know some of the local nurseries do sell espalier apple trees already started for you that you can then just kind of take home and care for. Yeah, good. Seeing lots of good comments coming in. Thank you guys so much for joining today. It's a lot to cover fruit trees. It's just so much to think about.
Then just the other question I saw was best time to fertilize fruit trees, if any?
Yeah, I think, just a spring fertilizer can just be enough. They don't typically need a whole lot. Oftentimes you're just going to go out with a balanced fertilizer in granular form, like a 10-10-10. That just means it has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium in those little granules. And you can go out with maybe like a quarter cup, half a cup of that. Read the label. I'm just throwing this out there. And then you'll sprinkle that around the drip line of the tree, which is where the roots are growing. So out away from the trunk, around the drip line, just once a year, maybe in the spring. Now, do watch some of these. I want to say plums can get some chlorosis from time to time, and that can happen more often if you have clay soil. And so you may need to add a little bit of iron. And pears also can be iron deficient. And so if you have heavy clay soils and you're starting to see yellowing of the leaves, then you might want to change your fertilizer over to something that has a little bit of iron in it as well.